Hello and welcome to Antinatalism This Week. Wirtschaftswunder is a German term for the rapid economic progress it did in the decade of 1950s following World War II. It was so fast that it is thought one of the economic miracles in the world. So that is a good thing. But can that or does that compensate for the enormous suffering imposed on humans in World War II in concentration camps? That is a question Karim Akerma asks in an interview published in a Polish journal called Filozofuj, which I think means philosophy. He has also published that same interview on his own blog, Anti-Natalism blog. Karim Akerma is a well-respected figure in antinatalist circles, and the interview in question-answer form is very interesting. He is comparing the suffering and happiness of the world and is asking the question if the amount of happiness that exists in the world can that compensate for the enormous amount of suffering that also exists in this world. There are also other interesting questions and answers in that interview. For example, there's a question about whether the burden of argument should be with antinatalists. Karim Akerma puts forth a very non-controversial rule. Never act in such a way that your actions will cause death of a person. On the face of it, this rule is very non-controversial. It is accepted mostly by all the people. But if you think the act of procreation will eventually bring a person who will inevitably die, so your action of procreation is causing death of a person inevitably, and therefore the burden of argument should be with procreators, pronatalists, and not with antinatalists, is what Karim Akerma says. This is not a new line of thought. Even Mahatma Gandhi has said, and I quote, "Suppose for a moment that all procreation stops, it'll only mean that all destruction will cease. Moksha is nothing but release from the cycle of births and deaths. This alone is believed to be the highest bliss, and rightly." End quote. Karim recognizes that the current economic structure, the current economic framework is based on growth oriented models. Capitalism, which drives the most of the economies in the world today, requires growth to happen, and it requires ever expanding populations, ever expanding number of consumers, and ever expanding goods and services. That is how the economies are structured today. If antinatalism has to be taken seriously, it will have to provide and it will enable antinatalists and denatalists to think about an alternative situation, an alternative economic model which is not growth oriented. He recognizes that reducing global birth rates will cause some economic problems with this growth oriented capitalist society. And so he says, and I quote, "It would be an attractive task to describe the economic form that would be required to allow an orderly ebbing away of mankind." End quote. There is also this question about animals other than humans, the non-human animals. Does antinatalism apply to them? This is a hot topic in antinatalist circles. The question is, to what extent does antinatalistic view also relate animals other than humans? Apart from sterilization of domestic species, should we also stop breeding farmed animals and strive for the gradual extinction of other species? Karim says that moral antinatalist theory requires moral persons to reduce suffering. That means reduce the amount of suffering of animals as well as reduce the number of animals which are suffering. To achieve this goal, Karim proposes 4 points as means. 1. Diet and clothing without animal products. 2. Extinction of livestock breeds through sterilization. 3. Sterilization of wild animals. And 4. Even if this results in extinction of entire species, and we may lament that as aesthetic loss, Karim says that we should keep in mind that propagation of species is a great generator of suffering. Some stereotypes were also talked about in that interview. For example, antinatalists hate children. Antinatalists want to kill other humans. Antinatalists want to kill themselves. Antinatalists want to destroy humanity. Antinatalists want more wars because that kills people. These are some of the stereotypes mentioned there, but I thought there are some more which could have been mentioned. For example, antinatalists are depressed. Antinatalism is a death cult. There is also a widespread belief that antinatalism means human extinction, or antinatalism is only against human procreation. Sometimes antinatalism also gets confused with child freedom, or antinatalism automatically means environmentalism, or antinatalism is woke. Lastly, there was also a mention of denatalism, and Karim clarifies that denatalism is a focus on reducing population for different reasons like scarcity of resources or for environmentalism, whereas antinatalism, or at least the ethical antinatalism, is focusing on reducing or prevention of suffering which is caused through procreation. Prindelinstitute.org is a website of the Prindle Institute for Ethics and Education. And we had looked at two articles on the website in one of the previous episodes of Antinatalism this week. We have another article, a third article on antinatalism this week by Errol Shanks, talking about antinatalism as well as responding to those two articles. Before we look into these arguments, we need to recall the original arguments of the previous articles. Laura Sisko had claimed that antinatalism is objectionably paternalistic. To do that, she had to define what is acceptable paternalism and then what is objectionable paternalism. She had defined the acceptable paternalism as interference into freedom of another for their perceived good. She takes example of seat belts. So in case of seat belts, we interfere into the freedom of people whether to wear seat belts or not because it is for their own good. Edil Shanks objects to this definition itself. He says that paternalism or acceptable paternalism is not interference into freedom of people for their good, or it is not for maximizing their well being, or it is not for maximizing their benefit, but rather to reduce or prevent harm to them. So, in case of seat belts, we are being paternalistic because we want to save them from possibility of them getting hurt. This makes sense. It even applies to antinatalism, even though Shanks doesn't extend this argument to do that. In case of antinatalism, we have a question of whether to bring future people into existence or not. If we do bring them into existence, we will be causing some kind of harm to them. The degree of harm varies, and whether that harm is compensated by the benefits of life is a different subject. But the fact of the matter is, we will be causing some degree of harm to them. Whereas if we don't bring them into existence, they will not be harmed. Nobody is harmed because they don't exist. And therefore, it makes sense, at least in the paternalistic sense, that antinatalist paternalism is acceptable. It is good to see articles like these published on websites of institutes like these by students, PhD students, or research students, or fresh PhD scholars. There was an article in Telegraph about Britain's declining birth rates. The story is that there was a discussion in Westminster about Birth Gap, which is a documentary made by Stephen Shaw. He was also invited to the discussion. Along with that, a Labour MP, Rosie Duffield, was also invited, but she had to pull out because too many online threats against her going to the discussion. The article talks about the discussion that happened about birth policies, pronatalist policies in different countries. It showed how it worked in China to an extent, but now they have a problem. It has not worked in countries like Japan, Korea, Denmark, Sweden, and many other. Hungary, Viktor Orban's Hungary, being only one exception where it seems to have worked after a lot of money spending by the government. Then it comes to Britain's birth cap. There are some problems. Britain is facing economic problems, problems like pension problems, shortage of labor, because of which there is high amount of immigration into Britain. And the author says that actually the blame lies on government policies and not on the fertility issues. It also says that if the fertility of the population decreases because of improvement in situation of women and education, is that really a bad thing? That's a question the article is asking. The other point it says is that from all this debate in the discussion in Westminster, what was missing was the actual people who were willingly child free and were still having fulfilled lives. This was also missing, or rather deliberately downplayed, in the documentary Birth Gap. So it was nice to see a little balanced article. Another point it made was that we should not be canceling these debates and discussions, even though they might be about pronatal. The reason it says is that if you do cancel them, then it gives a tool in the hands of right-wing conspiracy theorists. It cites Marie Le Pen of France and also Donald Trump now talking about poisoning the blood of America through immigration. So there's some truth in that also. We need a balance. We need to have discussions, debates, and we need to point out the flaws in pro-natalist sides. What is the difference between a country and a nation? A country is an administrative entity. It can have geographic land or even a water body, borders bounding that, a government, a set of rules by which its citizens should adhere, and so on. A nation or nationhood, on the other hand, is an idea, a common idea that binds the minds of its citizens. Hindutva, for example, is the feeling or the sense of belonging to a Hindu nation that forms a national identity. This national identity is then utilized by politicians to build a national rhetoric, which further feeds into national identity, which in turn bolsters national rhetoric. And the cycle goes on in a feedback loop. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has utilized reproduction as this idea, as this common idea to build a national identity and a national rhetoric. How he has done that is explained in the newly published paper, The Reproduction of Nationalism and the Nationalism of Reproduction, Putin's Biopolitics of Defending Tradition. In his 2014 speech, for example, he says that one of the three basic pillars of Russian society is taking care of mothers and children. He utilizes motherhood and the idea of reproduction as the common idea for building Russian national identity and Russian nation state. This helps in two ways. It gives him some common idea to build power upon, which was left in vacuum after the fall of Soviet Union, and it also helps against declining birth rates of Russia. This is particularly dangerous because this seems to be the trend in all the countries where birth rates are declining, and there are many. President Viktor Orban of Hungary, for example, is doing the same in his country. As antinatalists, we should be very aware and very well versed with these pro-natalist propagandas utilized for purposes like nation building. In the recent past, China has seen declining number of births per year. So if you look at this chart in 2022, the number of births was just around 9 million, which was the lowest since 1950s. This has made some demographers in China worried. According to an article in South China Morning Post, grandparents should be rewarded and any antinatalist content should be banned. Demographers are asking that grandparents to take care of children of their adult children who help their adult children in parenting should be rewarded and commended, whereas any content about being unmarried or being childless should be banned, prohibited, censored. It also said that local government should promote images of affectionate couples, happy families, and quality parent child moments at densely populated areas like large commercial districts, industrial estates, and wholesale markets. And I thought the irony is lost here. So the bottom line was promote pro-natalist content, ban, prohibit, censor anti-natalist content. One thing to note here is that I was not able to fact check what has been claimed in form of articles and the demographers' names independently. So we should take this with a pinch of salt. But I would not be surprised if China comes up with policies like these. Speaking of videos, this week there were many videos. The week started with an anti-natalist quiz hosted by Lawrence, which was quite good fun. Lawrence also posted another video about 10 reasons to be anti-natalist as listed on Listverse. Then there was also an interview of Carol Wainwright. So Carol Wainwright is an anti-natalist himself. He runs a channel called The Falcon Reads where he does review of different books. And he himself has written a novel on anti-natalist theme called The Unbearable Heaviness of Being or Life Reviled. The clue is in the title itself. Even though the book was published on 16th June, this interview was published this week on a channel called Jason Furman. MLP Torres has done extensive work on human extinction and extinction in general. They have written a long book on that. They have done many interviews, and there was one more interview published on the channel The Dissenter. It's the second part of the interview talking about extinction, existential ethics. They also talked about antinatalism. Emil also talked about David Benetta's asymmetry and why they now think that it is slightly incoherent, but they also think that the Schopenhauerian argument, which David Benetta has put forth about how awful the world is, they agree with that. And the news is that Emil P. Torres is writing a new article on this aspect, on this argument, which they agree, which is an exciting news. I'm looking forward to read that article. Overall, the interview was also quite good, deep as expected, so urge everybody to go and watch. Most antinatalists are either pro-death on abortion view or are pro-choice at least. It's very hard to find an antinatalist who is also pro-life, meaning who is against abortion. I'm not saying there are none, but they are rare comparatively. And there is one such antinatalist who also has a channel called Sophie, and he has made a video about why abortion is wrong. He makes a point between personhood and continuity of personhood. So he takes some hypothetical example of a person called Bob who goes into reversible coma and then comes up again as another person called Bill. And if we ought not to kill that person when that person was in coma, then a similar situation is there in case of abortion also, where there is a fetus and then there is a sentient baby. And in between, if we kill them, then we are killing that person. So the idea is that if you accept personhood and if you value that personhood from conception, then you ought not to do abortion. That was, I think, the idea made in the video. I can talk at length on this, but that was a brief. I urge everybody to go and watch that video. Even though I don't agree with this view and I am against pro-life view of abortion, it is good to have these ideas debated and discussed in the anti-natalist circles. And those were the stories that caught my eye about anti-natalism this week. If I've missed any, let me know. Thank you.